The Sunrise Morning Show continues. It's always great to talk to Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers, and he has a new show coming out in February. It's going to be on weekdays on EWTN Radio. It's going to be 4 Eastern on weekday afternoons. He's also the author of a book called Building a Civilization of Love, a Catholic Response to Racism. Deacon Harold, thank you for being on with us.
It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me today.
You know, as we mark the anniversary, it's a national sort of like feast day, right? Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and there's so much that people want to say about his life and legacy and the work that he did, but it strikes me every year how people want to sort of paper over the fact that this is a Christian pastor whose motivation for racial healing came from scriptures and his relationship with God. And, he was one of our Protestant brothers and sisters, but don't you think that's an important thing for us to highlight if we want to have this conversation?
Oh, it's extremely important. When you think about, how was this Southern Baptist preacher during the time of Jim Crow and all kinds of racial separation, how was he able to bring people together? How was he able to bridge the racial divide, that crossed political boundaries, that cross religious boundaries, that cross sociological boundaries, and bring people together. And that's why we haven't seen that kind of thing happening today, because they're trying to find cultural ways of solving this problem and dealing with the issue of race. But Martin Luther King relied on the gospel. And even though he didn't necessarily specifically spell it out, that it was the gospel, the way he went about it, the principles, and that's what brought people together. They are able to see past their differences and see, no, this guy makes sense. This is the way forward. And since he died, we have this gap, this chasm, and it hasn't been able to be bridged because we have people who are saying race, 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 but it really is a Trojan horse. There's a whole other agenda that has nothing to do with race, and that's why we're still seeing the problems that we have today.
Well, there certainly is, and the fact of the matter is the church had plenty to say on race over the years, but I want to go back to the gospel, because there's certain things that don't hit the same in the 21st century that they would have hit in Jesus' day. So when Jesus talks to the crowds and he's discussing this priest and this Levite that walk by a guy on the road, and then this Samaritan comes by, and the Samaritan is the guy that does all the help. That doesn't hit us because we don't understand the racial divides, the ethnic divides, the massive religious divides that would have been between Jews and Samaritans. I mean, Jesus is dealing with this stuff in the Gospels in a very clear way.
Oh, absolutely. He sets a whole new standard for how we're supposed to treat each other. And you're right. The Jews and the Samaritans hated each other, even though they were kind of like cousins. They really didn't deal much with each other at all. Like, for example, the woman at the well. I mean, she was shocked that Jesus went up to her because they're not even supposed to use the same utensils together. And so when Jesus tells that parable, it's very powerful. Here's a Jewish man that's at the side of the road that was mugged, and then the priest and the Levite walk by, but then the Samaritan, who's supposed to hate, he's the one who shows him mercy. Well, what's the lesson for us? Of course. What would we say? Oh, of course I would have helped him if that were me. Looking back, at, hindsight being 2020. But what if that person was the person who sexually assaulted you, who drove drunk and killed your parents, the person who got you hooked on alcohol and drugs? Oh, see, not so easy now, huh? But that's Jesus' point. He calls us to do what's seemingly impossible. We must be Samaritans. Jesus' teaching no longer requires people to be separate from each other, but to be a vehicle of mercy to the person standing in front of us, to look at the person in front of us and not to look at race, but to look at someone made in God's image and likeness. Once we do that, that's the first brick that has to be taken out of the wall of racial divide.
One of the things that frustrates me so much, Deacon Harold, is that some people will, and this happens so often in the media, will take questions like abortion and racism, and end-of-life issues, and break them up into 3 different categories. And if you talk about one, somebody will say, well, why aren't you talking about these other 2? Right? But if we truly understand the sanctity of life from the womb, right, if that's really something that we're going to double down, and if the bishops have told us that has to be the thing that we care about, first and foremost, and that informs everything else, then once we get that right, we have to start getting this other stuff right too, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. But you have to start in the womb. I mean, what you're talking about was, at least when I was growing up, they call it the seamless garment. You know, it's just one continuous issue of life. It doesn't matter whether it's abortion or racism or it's all the same. Well, it's not. Because if you don't have life, if you don't start with respecting all life, the dignity of all human life for the moment of conception, then what's the point? If you're not even alive, then race and all other stuff doesn't even matter. And so we have to see, yes, life is a continuous journey, but we're on pilgrimage here because this is not our home. And that pilgrimage journey toward heaven starts at the moment of conception.
It does indeed, and it always has. And I think that idea that the church has kind of been all in on this question from day one really helps inform us, because right now it's very easy for us to listen to one talking head or another talking head, get caught up in a talking point of whatever's happening in the news right now, right? And as Americans, we tend to view everything through the Civil War and slavery and all that stuff. And that is an important, extremely important conversation to have. But how has the church been here and in this conversation from long before there was ever such a thing even envisioned as the United States of America?
Well, yeah, the church is, the church has always taught since the beginning, we have to follow Jesus, and especially when you look at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, is kind of the fundamental basics of Jesus' teaching. And the church has always believed that. In fact, the church has been one of the strongest anti-slavery associations in the entire world. I mean, in the book, I go back and I look at all the councils of the church that specifically talked about opposing slavery. I looked at the teachings of the popes, even in the United States, when the bishop ignored the pope's teaching about anti-slavery. I showed that the church took a very strong stand against slavery. So even though the leaders in the church didn't follow what, in the United States, didn't follow what the Vatican was teaching, there were still people that stood up for the rights of all human beings.
Well, thanks so much, Deacon Harold and Anna Mitchell. It strikes me that throughout the history of the church has taught stuff, and a whole bunch of Catholics have ignored it along the way. But we owe it to the saints who got it right to back their play on this question. I do have a copy of the book, by the way, in my hand so that you can see it on the screen if you're looking for what it looks like in your local Catholic bookstore. Deacon Harold's book, Building a Civilization of Love, A Catholic Response to Racism. Anna Mitchell, this is